So normally at a venue like this, I talk about vaccination and the role in clinical reduction. But a couple of years ago, Reed convened a group of PRRS experts, which included Roger, and our focus was really on area or regional control, really following up on Joe's challenge, was eradication possible? And so throughout that discussion, growing pigs, their contribution to or distributing PRRS, what was a main focus of the conversation. And although 15 years later, we're still here talking about PRRS and there's no magic bullet, we also became aware there was numerous tools available, and if we could begin to use these tools together, could we make a larger impact and have a greater regional or area control, which would then make this eradication topic more relevant. So this first slide, I should just call it the Scott D slide. I mean, Scott D, basically, anything that Scott could creatively look at as a mechanism to show PRRS distribution, he ran an experiment and showed it was possible. Flies, mosquitoes, needles, pigs, aerosols, and of course my favorite, snowballs. But I mean, it really just literally shows the challenge we have with controlling PRRS because it just has so many different avenues to survive and spread. I won't go through this, but there's no doubt, and the previous speaker summarized it really well, vaccines do exactly what they say in the label, and that is reduce the clinical impact. And this is just a single example. This happens to be a study from Abby Patterson that summarizes 21 different studies with 8 different isolates. And in each and every study, there is a statistically significant reduction in clinical disease. One thing that's interesting about this paper that sort of shows the challenge that we have in the industry is all 8 of these isolates were obtained from what was characterized as a vaccine break. So these are isolates that in a lab study shouldn't work, and yet when we put them in a naive animal in a controlled environment, they do. And I think that represents the challenge we have with PRRS in our industry today. So as a background and part of the brainstorming that went behind some of the tough questions that Roger asked that led to the study we did, we sort of were reviewing the base information, and there's 2 or 3 studies that were done in the last couple of years that really impacted how we thought about PRRS and how we design studies in the future. And the first one was really some of the work done by Scott and Joel Nieram and Tom Wetzel relative to PRRS shed and spread in aerosols and what vaccine impact or role may play in that. And so basically what they did was they took a facility with 2 rooms, half of them were MLV vaccinated, half of them were not, and then exposed a subpopulation of animals in each room to PRRS and allowed that to shed and spread within a room. So animals were vaccinated early in the study on one side of the barn. Samples were taken. Subsequently, a virulent strain was introduced into that facility and allowed to shed and spread throughout the room, just as a normal infection would occur. Samples were taken throughout the study. And the main point I'm going to focus on here is the aerosol transmission portion of this, which I think is the groundbreaking and very informative part. You've all seen this from Scott in the past. These are his cyclonic collectors. And so they were able to both collect both days of shedding as well as attempt to quantitate the amount of RNA circulated. And the piece of this that was shocking and positively surprising, and it's summarized really at the bottom there, in a vaccinated group in this study there were 6 days of post-infection aerosol shedding compared to the 36 days in the non-vaccinated group. So 2 things. Aerosol shedding occurs, and if you use immunity or vaccination, you can reduce. It's not zero. It's not sterilizing immunity, but it's a statistically significant drop in reduction in that potential to circulate PRRS throughout the environment. The second study that I think was really groundbreaking and really forced all of us to reassess what we thought about PRRS comes from Daniel. And really, in this case, he took that same sort of study design and flipped it around. He started with PRRS-infected pigs, wild type, and then vaccinated on top of them. Here's his general study design. Again, introduce PRRS into the group, let it circulate around. After that, about day, I can't remember, 9 or 10, he then vaccinated. I believe they received 2 doses of vaccine. And then again, he followed the aerosol transmission in the same model that Scott used. Once again, despite the fact that PRRS is and can be spread through aerosolization, vaccination, even after the fact, allowed a significant reduction in the number of days of shedding that were detected. And again, this was a very exciting opportunity and really changed how we might use our tools and what opportunities we would have to move PRRS control to the next level. So, role of vaccine. No doubt there's a direct benefit, and we spent the last 20 years trying to control clinical disease because that's what people see, and that's a typical vaccine model. But what we found through Scott and his work and others is that there's a huge direct benefit, both in terms of shed and spread within pigs, between pigs, aerosols, and the environment. And these indirect levels, in my opinion, help reduce and mitigate the overall risk and take us to another level of being able to improve health production and potentially even support area control and maybe even the future eradication. So as we were having our brainstorming session, when we run a vaccine study, we vaccinate the animals, we give them a high dose of PRRS because you always want to use a high enough dose that nobody questions whether it was enough. And it's a real qualitative assessment. Controls get sick and vaccinates get less sick or don't get sick. And Roger just simply asked a simple question: what dose of challenge can PRRS vaccine withstand? And I kind of stunned. We've done this for 20 years and we don't really know. Jeff Zimmerman has certainly done work where he titrated the infectious dose of PRRS. But we've never looked at it the opposite way. How much can a pig withstand? And so if you look at the context of the Scott and the Daniel studies, if PRRS is shedding at a certain level, can you get vaccination at a level that you can withstand the shedding levels in aerosols, flies, and mosquitoes, and again, use those as tools to help with area control and eradication? So we designed a relatively simple study, quite a few pigs, but a simple study, randomized study, blinded, 3-week-old animals. They were naive, and then statistics were done on a group comparison basis. I'll walk you through this just to orient you for the next slide. So 5 groups of animals, and each group was treated differently. Some of the animals were vaccinated. In this particular study, it was Engelbach PRRS. And we also had non-vaccinated controls that were matched with them. Group 5, you'll see, did not get vaccinated, so that remains the comparison control throughout the group. And then on day 28, various groups, 1, 2, 3, and 4, received different doses of challenge. So typically in a vaccine study that we run, we would expose animals to 4 to 6 logs of challenge, and that would be it would be a qualitative challenge, and vaccine did or didn't work. So in this case, we did a titration at 1 log levels, and instead of necropsy at day 14 and looking at lung lesions, which would be a typical pig model, we let these animals go a longer period of time, hoping to see some differences over time. The primary parameter that we measured was viremia. I mean, if you're going to talk about area control, it's really about, can you reduce virus and viral loads? We did obviously measure temperature and average daily gain just as surrogates to the study. So one thing I want to put up front, just as you look at these, all of the viremia we did was by PCR. We've saved these samples, and based on the results, we may go back and do virus isolation. And there's an internal debate whether that's good enough or whether we should steal from Jeff Zimmerman and do bioassay, because ultimately that's probably the real measure. And we used just a PCR. The PCR was all done by Iowa State, so there was no differential between the vaccine and the challenge. So that's why it has to be a group comparison. So in a vaccinated group that's viremic and you challenge on top, in theory that could be a mixed population, and this PCR data in its current form doesn't differentiate those. So I want to be clear up front and not over-present that. So let's jump in. So this first table would be, I would call, a typical vaccine study. So the red line is the challenge controls. On day 28, they were exposed. Immediately, animals go to 100% viremia. They're viremic for out to 56 days, and then there's a slow and gentle decline. If you look at the navy blue line, that is vaccine only. So at 28 days of age, those animals are still viremic, and so that's vaccine virus, and again, it's kind of bounces around, and it also declines over time. If you look at the lighter blue line, which is the challenged vaccine group, you will see that there is a reduction in viremia in vaccinated animals, but it's above the vaccine-only group, and it's below the challenge group. So this would be a typical study that anybody that runs a heterologous study would see a trend like this, that there's always a vaccine effect. It's always lower than controls, but there's always some level of virulent virus there. I'm only going to show you the 2-log group because really the 1 and 2-log group look the same, but this was the challenge dose level where we began to see a differential effect. So this study, again, this is 2 logs of challenge. So if you look at the red line, which is the challenge control, once again, the kinetics are slightly different. There's a little bit of a delay, but all of those animals become viremic. They become viremic for a fair amount of time, and then by day 63 or 70, they reduce. If you look at the dark blue line again, that's vaccine only. And in this case, with the 2-log exposure, the vaccinated challenge group, those lines literally lay on top of each other. We don't have the differential PCR here, but this would be a suggestive indicator that the wild-type virus didn't really take here, and what we're probably measuring is Engelvac viremia, suggesting that at this level of exposure, vaccine had some ability to sort of blunt or prevent the wild-type infection. And I'll show you some CT values shortly to sort of back this up. So here's the CT values, just for those of you that you can give your own assessment. But again, the light blue and the green lines are the vaccinate and the vaccinate exposure to 2 logs. Again, you'll see those lines lay very close together, and those are high CT values, so those are relatively low levels. We believe that if the Engelvac challenge group had wild-type virus in there, our CT values in those groups, although they were positive, would look more closely to that red line. And so we again believe this supports that at a 2-log level, we were able to relatively blunt that infection. And we are going to go back and sort of reconfirm this with some differential PCRs and potentially bioassay. Some other evidence that's indirectly supportive, more on the clinical side, is the pyrexia. Again, vaccinated group after exposure, regardless of exposure as a typical vaccine study, had lower levels of days of fever compared to challenge controls. And again, if you look at the challenge controls, quite a bit higher. And then again, you really don't see any difference between a vaccinated and a vaccinated challenge group at that 2-log level or lower. Again, supporting that immune system wasn't very active, and there probably wasn't a lot of wild-type virus circulating, or we would have seen a febrile response. Similar trends on the average daily gain. Vaccinated groups, regardless of dose, had higher average daily gains. The challenge controls, of course, had the lowest and largest impact. And once again, 2 logs or lower, those groups, vaccine challenge or vaccine only, were relatively undifferentiated, so suggesting again that this 2-log within this study was sort of where the line could be drawn. So, is there a challenge dose of which vaccine can blunt an infection? This is an N of 1, it's 1 study, but in this study it would be suggested that 2 logs or lower, the impact of wild-type exposure in a vaccinated animal was the same as vaccine alone. And so this is sort of a baseline to start our discussion. Similar to other challenge studies, we saw benefits in average daily gain, reduced viremia, reduced temperature, regardless of exposure. So what's the relevance in the field? The relevance in the field is our industry, despite the fact that none of us are satisfied where we're at, we've done an incredible job defining tools, mechanisms, strategies, filters, management, all of which help reduce the PRRS load. We can do that. We do it. So the question now is, if you can reduce the load, and if you can develop a vaccine that is refractory to a vaccinated or immunized animal that's refractory to infection, and that animal either sheds low or lower levels, can you continue to move the bar down? And that was really a challenge that Roger gave us, was how do we use this information for something practical? And so one of the conversations that is happening is we've used a clinical model of measuring either reproductive performance or lung lesions to evaluate efficacy. And should our model now be something like this, where we titrate how refractive a group is to sort of a challenge effect and reassess our vaccine protocols by this way? If a one dose in a naive animal is refractory to 2 logs, does 2 doses take us to 3 logs? Does vaccination of a positive herd take us to 4 logs? And does that information help us generate improved methods of area control? So relevance in the field, I think common sense would say the lower the PRRS exposure we have, the better it is for our industry, whether it's shedding infection or whether it's protection in a pig. And so that's something we should all strive for. I think we're going to use this level of infection model to evaluate further vaccine protocols. Right now, we can't really articulate or communicate if you've vaccinated an animal, how protected your herd are. We might be able to semi-quantitate in the future, if you use this vaccine protocol, you can expect some level of difference between a different protocol. And then again, continue. The benefit of this, of course, is you're going to get the clinical side effect, which is the benefit that we all see immediately. So in my opinion, despite the fact we haven't hit the home run, there is no magic bullet, and PRRS remains a significant challenge. We started out in the 90s with the PRRS cloud that caused clinical problems and was almost overwhelming. We took a big step forward through vaccination and immunization protocols to reduce or help control the clinical benefit or impacts. As an industry, we've made huge strides in management. We certainly understand and have the tools now to measure PRRS, monitor PRRS, and even differentiate treatments within the models. Even today, I'm still surprised that Jeff and Scott's work, those models actually allow us to measure a treatment effect. You would think some of that aerosol work would be so variable, but that would be difficult. But those models do exist, and they do work, and they can be quantitated. And so I think we've actually now moved to the smallest bubble. And again, I think pig genetics could play another step forward there. If pigs are resistant, if we have tools to minimize PRRS exposure, if we have protocols to generate immunizing potential in animals where they are able to blunt off certain levels of PRRS, we might be able to continue to incrementally move the PRRS levels low enough where area control becomes more and more successful. So obviously again, this is an N of 1, and there's more questions to answer. PRRS is never that easy. We used a single challenge isolate. Probably needs to be reproduced with different isolates to make sure. We use negative pigs. We definitely will look at different protocols. We'll always use the negative pig as the benchmark. But are there different protocols that raise, instead of 2 logs of refractory to 3 to 4, can we get higher? And of course timing. There's huge differences between pigs and sows or gilts in terms of how they respond to PRRS, and so animal age will also play a role. So I think some of the challenges that Roger gave us by asking a very simple question has really reopened our eyes about how to look at PRRS vaccination and potentially different study designs that might provide different and better solutions to the industry.